Welcome to Connecting Dots, a laser-focused quick-fire interview on food and the economy with international experts where we seek answers to questions all of us should be asking. I'm Ajay Jakhat, Chairman, Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India, as well as the Vice Chair of Action Track 2, Shift to Sustainable Consumption Patterns at the UN Food Systems Summit. I'm delighted today to introduce Professor Ravi Kanbur, the Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Cornell University. You have also served in the past as Director of the World Bank World Development Report. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Ajay. Thank you for the invitation.
You are a member of the Food Systems Economics Commission, the work of which will shape policies way into the distant future. But we will get there later in this interview. My first question to you is, in 2020, you argued that two major obstacles for national policies that aim to reduce income inequality are cross-border spillovers and a lack of international coordination in responding to inequality. In this regard, the recent corporate tax reform by G7, coming after the European Commission and Biden administration's push for a minimum corporate tax, was hailed as a historic move. Do you think this marks a decisive shift in international establishments' response to rising inequalities, or you think it is too little and too late?
Well, thank you for that question, Ajay. I don't think it's too late. It's never too late, and I'm glad that this move was indeed made. Of course, me, given my writings and so on, believe that it is too little, but I think it's a very good start, and I think we then, the analysts and advocates from outside, should be pressing for more. I think the devil is going to be in the implementation detail of this thing. So I think what we have to do is to watch out for how it's actually implemented, and whether there are put in sort of escape hatches and escape routes, which may negate the intent of the policy change. But I think the intent is there, and so let's welcome it and but push for more.
Very good. So, which you're saying is that everything is in the details. That the devil is in the details.
The devil is always in the details.
Always in the details. Globally, rapid technology change and innovation have reduced the value of unskilled labor and the number of available jobs. The economic impact of the pandemic has worsened this trend. What we increasingly see is that labor laws are being diluted to attract investments, including in my country. In that context, can you reflect on your 2018 paper where you wrote that the crisis of labor cannot be solved through skilling and redistribution alone, but also through shifting the trajectory of technological change? Can you explain this, and how would you view that statement today?
Yes, so again, thank you for that question. I'm really, in a sense, reflecting the thinking and the work of the late great economist Tony Atkinson, who passed away a few years ago, one of the doyens of work on inequality globally. And he said, exactly that what we, particularly as economists, do is to take the trend of technology as given. And then we feed it through our analysis and say, well, the technology is having this effect or that effect, and let us try to mitigate that, either through, as you said, educational investment and so on and so forth, or redistribution after the event. Both of those are important. There's no question, both of those are important. But the question that Tony Atkinson raised, which is very important, is why should we take this trend as given? And when you make that point, some people respond saying, well, what can you do? But we can then point to examples in the past where actually society has indeed affected a change in the trend of technology. All the stuff on high yielding varieties and so on didn't just happen by itself. It happened because society said, let us try to work with this. And indeed, the reason why we're speaking like this now is because the government invested in the internet and all of these sorts of things. So we have indeed, in the past, made a shift in technology. And my question is, why can't we now do it? Why should we take the trend as given? Why can't we do it now? I suppose one counter to that is that the nature of technology is now different. It's much more distributed. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you could be in a government lab and do this work. But now it's people writing codes in different parts of the world and so on and so forth. So we have to think differently about how we engage. But I don't think we should be taking the trend of technology as being given at all.
You have written about declining relevance of the World Bank. Its main instrument of the sovereign loan has been successfully replicated by regional development banks, and its governance structure precludes inclusive and representative consensus building. Do you see all multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the UN suffering similarly due to changing global order, rise of nationalist governments, and the decline of true internationalism and more powerful corporate houses? Is there a
So I think this is, sorry, please go ahead.
So is there a connection between rising corporate houses and businesses and this nationalist governments?
So I think there's a general issue. I write about the World Bank because I know about it, but I think there's a general issue about about architecture of global institutions and global cooperation, which is basically that they reflect the realities of 1945, not the realities of 75 years later. I think that's the fundamental problem, the fundamental issue, that these institutions were structured at that time, and as I've written, they were indeed successful. The so-called golden age of 30 years of growth in the West, from 1945 to 1975 and so on, these institutions played their role in bringing that about. But I think as cross-national and cross-border problems have grown, into climate change and excuse me, financial contagion and so on and so forth, I think these institutions are left wanting. Their instruments are left wanting, and that's what I've been arguing. Now, I think that to some extent that is true of all institutions more generally, but I take the World Bank as an illustration of this point. And particularly, I would say that in fact, as you mentioned, the relevance, the significance of the World Bank in the world economy has actually declined considerably. If you take India, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, the World Bank's financial input to the Indian economy was huge. Okay? But now, the amount of money that India brings to the table, that the World Bank brings to the table in India, actually is just a minuscule amount of the total government resources. So in that sense, in the big economies like India and China and Brazil and Mexico, all these big economies, the financial weight of the World Bank has gone down dramatically. There are some African countries, of course, where it is still quite prominent. So specifically for the World Bank, I think there's that issue that its influence is gone, and some may think that's a good thing, but that is a fact of life.
So keeping to the World Bank, although the World Bank has been instrumental in the post-war global recovery, it has also been criticized for its role in influencing the economic policies and development agendas of developing nations. The Washington Consensus role in imposing free market ideology and reforms on the developing countries has led to significant opposition from the population of these nations. In light of this, many have called for World Bank and IMF to operate within a framework of human rights. What would your views be on this subject?
Yeah, so again, I would say that, so first of all, let's go back to the facts that I was laying out earlier, which is that actually the financial significance of the World Bank, let's say in a country like India, is now minimal. It's minuscule, okay? So the notion that somehow it's the World Bank tail that is wagging the entire dog, it doesn't hold muster just now. But let me step back a little bit and say that the issue that you raise of, in a sense, it's an issue of a balance between state and market. And that, again, in my writings, I've said that essentially what we've seen over the years are cycles in thought, where the pendulum has swung one way, then it swung the other way, then it swung back again, and so on. And at any point in time, we're at some point in that pendulum swinging back. In fact, if one goes back again, the market orientation of the pre-war economies led to the Great Depression and so on. And then after the war, we had a very, very big role for state and so on. And that led to its own reaction. And then that led to its own reaction. And one of the points that I've been making in my recent writings is that let us not be too comforted by the notion that the pandemic has laid out a role for the state, an increased role for the state. Because in fact, if past cycles are anything to go by, this will actually have its own reaction and it will indeed be pulled back into it, which is what happened after the global financial crisis. When if you recall the global financial crisis of a dozen years ago, the notion was, well, this is it. The history has changed. Now people will recognize the role of government and so on. Well, 3-4 years later, we were back to the usual sorts of debates on the balance between state and market. So what I've argued is, stepping back from any particular institution or any particular thing, this debate about the balance between state and market is a perennial for us. And of course, circumstances change, technology changes, governance changes, and so on. And so the debate is always cast in new terms, but the debate is essentially always the same. Where do you end up on that spectrum between state and market? And of course, my instincts and my writings is always to be more towards the state side of that spectrum. But I recognize there are these cycles in global thinking, in global and in global policies as well.
Coming to the Food Systems Economic Commission, would be great if you enlighten those listening in today onto the objectives of the Commission, and more specifically on developing evidence-based tools and policy frameworks for a food systems change.
Well, thank you very much for that question. The Food Systems Economic Commission is a scientific commission. It's a commission of technicians and analysts, academics, who've been brought together to essentially look at the scientific aspects of the food system broadly construed. There are some specific aspects to it, which is that the Commission has chosen to focus on 3 elements of the food system. Obviously, the climate implications on the production side of things, environmental climate implications. Also, on the consumption side, the whole issue of an affordable diet. And the Eat Lancet Commission made a proposition that actually a healthier diet was also more sustainable from the production side of things. And we want to explore that more. But I think the biggest issue that this commission brings in is the issue of inclusion. It's the affordability of a healthy diet, which is important, and also whatever measures that are being taken to make food systems more sustainable. What do they mean in terms of inclusivity, in terms of income distribution, and so on? Because what we don't want to do is to achieve sustainability on the backs of poor farmers, on the backs of poor consumers, and there could well be a tendency towards that if we're not careful. So the notion of inclusion and distribution, inequality, poverty, is central to the thinking and the work of the Commission, of this group of analysts and technicians who've been brought together to analyze this issue.
It's really nice to hear that, because when we hear debates in various forums across the world, we hear people talking about, how we need to achieve a net zero. But as a farmers organization, we are always saying, till a farmer does not get dignity from the work that he does in terms of the income that he makes out of it, that change is not going to happen. And we're happy to hear that you have that included in the Commission. My question that comes now is, as a farmers organization, we believe having farmers on the table is very essential for a food systems thinking. There appears to be no farmers on the Food Systems Economic Commission. Is the Commission still evolving to be more inclusive?
I think the response to that, I think it's a good question, and it's an important question to ask. I think the response to that is that this is really a scientific commission. It's a commission of scientists and analysts and modelers and academics. And so our role is to provide technical input into the broader discussions, where in fact constituency groups and stakeholder groups are present and so on. Like, for example, in the Food Systems Summit, with which you're, of course, very, very familiar. So it's platforms like that which I think are better suited to bring in different stakeholders and so on. So, for example, consumer groups should also be consulted, of course, and governments, as representing the taxpayer, should also be consulted, and so on and so forth. So we view our role as providing the technical input into these discussions. Now, having said that, I think you're very right. It is very important for us to run our analysis and our findings by different stakeholder groups. And I hope that we'll be able to do that once the findings start rolling out. We've only just started. One point I would say, Ajay, is that the Commission has of course started its work, and it will actually, its life extends beyond the Food System Summit. I think that's very important to realize. Everything these days, as I'm sure you know, is geared towards the Food System Summit, and quite rightly, there's no question about that. But there is life after that. And we hope that the Food Systems Economic Commission will provide the analytical and technical platform for continuing the dialogue and the debate, at least on the scientific level, for 2 years beyond the Food Systems Summit. And we look forward to engagement with you and other groups during that phase as well.
Thank you so much, because I think that's very important. A lot of the policy I see in the developing world is being made without basis of any scientific evidence to support those policy steps that the governments are taking. When it comes to the last question, which is the commoditization of food in the global economy has led to rising levels of hunger and malnutrition. And this has been worsened in this pandemic. At the same time, farm gate prices for farm producers remain low. Market prices do not reflect the true and social and ecological costs of producing food, let alone dignity. What role should the governments and markets play in rebalancing the food systems in favor of farmers and low-income groups? And this is exactly the pendulum that you were talking about. Between governments and markets, it keeps swinging. So where do you think that today the governments should be doing to make sure that there is equity and inclusiveness in the market?
So again, so one is this sort of constancy, this great pendulum. And another great constancy, I think, in thought and so on, are the different trade-offs that are involved. And essentially what governments have been engaged in, including in India, but in many other countries, is trying to raise prices for farmers to give them an adequate income, and trying to lower prices for consumers, particularly for poor consumers, to help them. And of course, the gap between high prices for farmers and low prices for consumers has to be filled somehow. The sums have to add up somehow. And the question is, who's been filling that gap? And ideally, the gap would be filled by taxing those who are best off in a society. But in fact, if we look at the overall tax systems of many countries, they are not as progressive as they should be. So in fact, it's actually taking with one hand and giving with one hand and taking back with another. Because in fact, these taxes, if we have, say, broad taxes like VAT and so on, are actually landing on the same people from whom you're trying to help. So I use this to say that actually, although the food system is an important lens through which to see these things, it is not the only lens. And the issues of inclusion and equity and so on are, of course, much broader than the food system. The food system is not the source of all of the problems, nor is it the source of all of the solutions in this thing. So I would sort of step back a bit from this and say, what are the general inclusion questions that a society faces? And then think of the food system as being an important, a crucial component of that, but not the only component.
I think that's a good way of putting it, to have a broader view but still have a systems approach to it. And that, I think, is, with my experience with India and other places, is that those in government and policy making have still not got used to the idea of thinking in a systems approach. And hopefully the commission of which you are a member will come out with scientific evidence to support that kind of approach. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. Really pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ajay, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you on this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.